The new Australian government is taking its pledge on improving its climate change policies rather seriously. On Thursday, the new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said that Australia will unveil a more ambitious carbon emissions target very soon and will bid to co-host a COP summit with its Pacific Island neighbours soon as well. This announcement comes during her first solo overseas visit to Fiji since a centre-left government was sworn in this week. Wong even admitted that Australia has neglected its responsibility on climate change under past governments. The new administration in Canberra was elected on the back of a promise of reducing emissions by 43% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. Wong said that the campaign pledges were not just empty promises and that the government plans to enshrine them in law as well.
And I understand that under past governments, Australia has neglected its responsibility to act on climate, ignoring the calls of our Pacific family to act, disrespecting Pacific nations in their struggle to adapt to what is an existential threat. But whether it manifests in rising sea levels or in disastrous bushfires and catastrophic flooding, climate change is happening across the Pacific family. So I assure you, we have heard.
For the last decade, under the previous Conservative government, Australia has lagged behind on climate action. Unlike other G20 countries, Australia did not strengthen its 2030 target ahead of last year's climate summit held in Glasgow. Canberra is also the third largest exporter of fossil fuels, and there are 114 new gas and coal mining projects in the pipeline. Experts noted that while the Labour government's new target is roughly compared to the one set by Japan and Canada, it is not ambitious as those of the EU, the UK or the United States. And for further perspectives, with us on the broadcast this minute is Dr. Benjamin Herskovch, Research Fellow, Centre for International Governance and Justice, with us from Sydney. Thanks very much for being here with us. Your assessment of to what extent the new government will actually be able to translate these pledges into action and the promises that have been made so far. What do you make of those?
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you and your audience. I think it's fair to say that the new Australian government is sincere on this issue. They're really committed to it. They have a long track record in opposition of advocating for stronger action on climate change. And they also have a mandate for it in that they've just come through an election. They won that election. It's been very tight, the results, and a lot of independents have been put in the Australian Parliament. But those independents want even stronger action on climate change than the Labor Party has proposed. So there's a strong political consensus and there's a big mandate publicly for it. So I expect that they will push forward with more ambitious targets than the previous government in Australia. As you noted, Australia is coming off a very low base here, having been dragging the chain on climate change action for many, many years. So it's unclear whether the targets of the new government in Canberra will be adequate. And in fact, there is a lot of debate in Australia, including among crossbenchers in the Parliament, those independents who've won seats, saying what the government is doing is a good step in the right direction, better than the previous government, but ultimately inadequate given the scale of the climate change challenge confronting the world. The other thing to note on all of this is that even though in part the government is being sincere and is doing the right thing for the right reasons, they're also motivated by hard-headed strategic considerations. We've had a security agreement signed between Solomon Islands and China. We have the Chinese foreign minister touring a range of countries in the South Pacific, and all of that is making Australia nervous. And Australia knows that a big weakness for Australia in the Pacific has been our inaction on climate change. So this is in part, maybe even in large part, about Australia building bridges in the South Pacific and recuperating its reputation, so to speak.
How significant is the fact that Australia is bidding to co-host that COP summit with its Pacific Island neighbours soon? Also, talking about how this government was elected on its promise of fighting climate change. That was one of the major reasons why it struck that chord with the electorate in Australia, with that promise of reducing emissions by 43% by 2030.
I think you're absolutely right that hosting a COP is very significant, particularly because if you take on that kind of responsibility, it locks you into a certain extent in pursuing relatively forward-leaning, relatively ambitious policy responses. And the other aspect of it is that if you're hosting a COP in collaboration with South Pacific or Pacific countries more broadly, that also sets a very high bar, because those are some of the countries in the world that will be most severely impacted by climate change. So arguably, this bid to host a COP would encourage the Australian government to be more proactive on this issue of climate change. But I think we also have to be realistic about this and say that in part the government is doing this for pragmatic political reasons, for domestic political reasons, to portray itself in a positive light and to win over many of the Australian voters who want the government to do more on climate change. Hosting a COP is a bit of a marketing exercise on some level, I think, domestically. And then it's also, in part, a bit of a diplomatic exercise for the Australian government in the South Pacific and in the region more broadly to say, look, we're doing this, we're taking it seriously, you can trust us on these issues. So it's partly self-interested and self-serving, as well as being something that is relatively ambitious and relatively significant.
Right, and we have been constantly highlighting on this very show the impact that climate change has already had on Australia and how significant the fight against the climate crisis really is for the country. We're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for being here on WION World is One.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.